Hello, my name is Garrett DeHond, and I'm an assistant professor at Hanguk University of Foreign Studies Department of English Linguistics and Language Technology. I'm presenting to you today some of the preliminary findings in a dissertation I've been working on for some time now. The title is, as you see, Critical Thinking versus Cognitive Presence in L2 Peer and Teacher Response. So essentially, the idea here is that we're not just looking at any types of critical thoughts coming from all people participating in the response activity, but also how they work together to create a conversation about these thoughts, and also having the peer and the teacher context together. So we will get into that right now. So for the most part, peer response discourse has a 40-year history in both composition and second language studies, where different researchers have been trying to characterize what peer response looks like. And for most of that history, we have seen work in what we might call now traditional, but really offline environments, where the peer response activities are normally oral discourse, conversations at tables with other students, though certainly there can be written discourse either as its own study or combined with the oral discourse. And you see here some frequently cited example traditional discourse items, where we have researchers studying things like students' roles in the activity, or the rules the community has set up, how they negotiate ideas or stances or exhibit certain types of behaviors. And again, for almost all of these examples that you see here, they are taking place at a time before computers were fairly common in the learning environment, and students are usually engaging in an oral or maybe sometimes written role. So when we get to the 2000s, we start seeing a shift in the literature where there's more exploration of digital online environments. Sometimes these start with computer labs, or they might be really getting into shared work through email or through Google Docs, as you'll see in the study that I've done. And many, though not all of those studies, especially in the 2010s, sort of focused on comparing the online operations of peer response to the offline or traditional versions. And in a lot of ways, researchers were interested in the online tool as a possible remediation or extension of peer response activities. So what that does is a couple of things. It sort of, even unintentionally, nests a certain control or comparison idea of how the traditional practices were successful, or maybe even like right to some readers' minds in terms of how to do peer response, and trying to make sure that the online version complements that, is not an impediment to that, or can even enhance it in some particular way. We see different examples in the slide here where not only were these these researchers investigating those new environments, but they were also doing it in manner sort of similar to what might have been done in the traditional settings, examining negotiations. Liu and Sadler have a pretty famous study that investigated area, nature, and type, and how different researchers sort of expanded on that. Here's the Liu and Sadler framework that became popular right here. I use this as an example of what we might see in a lot of peer response studies, where as the literature continues, more researchers are trying to come up with different, as you see here, dimensions of looking at peer response, trying to combine those dimensions together to see some different factors in what constitutes an actual like utterance or comment in peer response. But one thing that comes out of a lot of these studies, even though they are quite useful in better understanding the actual observed activities and possibilities for other research, is we're more often looking at these utterances in isolation. So in any kind of study that might use the Lewin-Sadler framework, we might see a global revision-oriented evaluation of one utterance. But that is examined in its isolation and not in comparison or even in concert with other comments that might have occurred in the peer response activity. So we're not getting, as the slide suggests, a sequence of comments being examined. Rather, we are looking at what the isolated utterances was able to capture in that particular moment. It's also worth noting that there have been some research trends where, and this includes both the first 20 and the more recent 20 years of peer response studies, there have been some trends of examining and comparing peer feedback and teacher feedback when it comes to how it affected student revisions or what students thought of that, etc. Normally, however, these are treated in isolation. So, for example, a study might look at what the peer comments were, what the teacher comments were, evaluate them in pretty similar manner, and yet those would have been separate activities issued at different times. We do not have many investigations in the literature of peer and teacher response in tandem. In other words, in a situation where the instructor and the students, writer and reader both, are operating in a shared space. And one reason why that interests me is because with today's modern affordances, Google Docs being a reasonable example of this, that is technically possible. Whereas in the early days of peer response literature, it would have been a stretch to make that feasible for an instructor to actively investigate different groups in the classroom, add to the comments, share back and forth. So one of the goals of this study was to try to not only look at peer response in an online environment and not do just a comparison to more traditional offline methods, but trying to think about ways in which we could use the tool to try new ways of peer response that hadn't really been investigated nearly as much. Now, as I suggested earlier, what you're going to see in this presentation is part of a larger study, a dissertation, that is investigating what we might call an instructor-peer tandem approach that also uses community of inquiry research to investigate, and I'll explain about that more in a moment. The larger study that I'm working on investigates these multiple areas of peer and teacher response in a practical inquiry context, as well as investigating student and instructor perceptions. But for this presentation, we're basically going to focus on this one big question, which is how a tandem approach, if you will, to peer response, having an instructor be part of any of these collaborative groups, indicate critical thinking and collaboration. And I would discuss critical thinking here as not just the ability to create a critical thought about the paper that is being examined, but also thinking about how comments come together to reach some type of conclusion. So we have here the concepts and the questions of perceptions and conceptions. So a couple of questions here are about how any of the collaborators, the essayist, the student reader, or the instructor in the class, either opens perceptions to share a problem that they perceive, or responded with their own perceptions to that problem. And in this context, conceptions would be new ideas that emerged from developing conversation, and how we also make determinations of those conception qualities. These concepts come from community of inquiry research, which normally tries to investigate an educational experience in terms of how it has cognitive presence, social presence, and teaching presence. And my dissertation is focused on all three of these presence areas, but this presentation is focusing more on the blue circle section, the cognitive presence. And cognitive presence is a little bit unlike the other two in that it looks at practical inquiry phases of developing these perceptions and conceptions. So we are starting from, in many cases, triggering events which induce a problem and go through an evocative process, to later explorations where we start sharing some inquiries into possibilities and diverging where necessary or interesting to the participants for better understanding what was triggered. Those are perceptions, and what conceptions ought to be, at least in this context of a response activity, is we're trying to come up with convergent tentative options based on the perceptions or maybe other conceptions. So in other words, we are trying to come to some determination on a good idea for revisions based on what other people, not just one person, have already said about the issue. And then in this context, resolutions would be showing commitment or challenging commitment or trying to come to some deduction on how well these integrations work. So for this dissertation, I looked at 3 different classes, all of which are in the Korean L2 for English writing context. You see the breakdown on the slide here of number of classes, number of students per class, the number of essays that they worked on, their normal learning management system, and also in this case, they all, in the case of 2 instructors, 1 instructor with 2 classes, worked with Google Docs. In all 3 classes, students worked most often in dyads, though there were some situations of 2 readers per essay. That not as frequent, but it does show in the data. And then the instructor in all 3 classes is joining these peer groups. So essentially what is happening in all 3 classes is we're working in one Google Doc for the essay, and we can see comments from the writer, the reader or readers of the essay, and also the instructor as well. And for all of these papers, we are looking at probably a minimum 5 comment threads. So if we are getting to 3 persons doing at least a minimum 1 comment per thread, we're looking at a minimum 15 comments total, though many papers go quite a bit longer than that with extra comments on other issues or even extended threads, which I will get to in a moment. So here is the breakdown of the number of posts per class per person, and you also see a breakdown of the number of posts per thread. To make it simpler for the presentation, I make a note of 3 post threads, which is usually but not always 1 per member type, as well as posts that are below and above that threshold. So one thing to keep in mind here is that we're looking at 1 writer per essay, of course, 1 reader or more per essay, and the instructor in all the essays. So when we look at the numbers here, we need to understand that there is 1 particular individual per class who is working as the instructor, posting for all of these papers, where we have, in the example of Alex's class, for instance, we have 15 writers for 2 different essays, and then that combination again plus for any of the reader posts. And so the following slides are going to have all classes combined together, and we're going to start with the phases of practical inquiry. So as a reminder, triggering events are usually opening the conversation or might be inducing a new problem in the conversation. Explorations are more perceptions of that trigger that are coming from other members in the group. integrations are trying to come up with a new idea based on the conversation from two or more individuals, and resolutions are putting those to the test a little bit. So what we see here in this breakdown is most of the time for all three classes, the writer is the one that is triggering a discussion of problems, because it was the preference of both the instructors that the writer tried to initiate conversations about what they were most concerned with, though there were certainly opportunities for the other two type of persons, respondents and instructors, to do that as well. And then the respondents most often explore, that is basically most often reply to the writer, though of course the other two types, writers and instructors, do this as well. And then when we get to integrations, not only do we see a drop-off compared to what you see in explorations here, but it is most often the instructor trying to integrate ideas together, whereas resolutions barely comes up at all for all three classes. So one way to interpret the findings that we see at the moment is that there is definitely a concerted effort to investigate a problem with triggers, and there are many explorations. Sometimes there will be threads where there are two or more explorations of that initial trigger. But then we don't see integrations appearing as much. And this is fairly consistent with community of inquiry research. Oftentimes discussions have an abundance of explorations and kind of stop there. So that is not particularly shocking, though it is worth noting that in community of inquiry research, we do not have a large number of peer/teacher response studies being examined. But that does also indicate that the discussions are not often leading to a phase of, okay, based on what everyone is talking about, here's what we might consider doing, or what you, the writer, might consider doing, which is important to consider in terms of how the individuals get evidence of the usefulness of the activity, as well as trying to make sure we have good ideas for revising the paper, not just our own ideas for revising the paper. Okay, so the following three slides are discussing the four different phases of practical inquiry. So we start with triggers, then explorations, and we'll have integrations and resolutions closely wrapped up together. And to further clarify, we want to understand that every single post, every single comment is being analyzed here from all of these different collaborators. And all of those comments can only be one phase. The entire comment should basically be a trigger, exploration, integration, or resolution, and how it carries us through that practical inquiry process. With all of these different phases, there are different ways that we can code what type of trigger, exploration, etc. it is, which you'll see here on the slides. So as far as triggers were concerned, I mentioned earlier that writers do most of the triggering in all three of these classes. And normally we are seeing recognition of problems and recognition of opportunities. So that is described as saying a statement of something being wrong or needing an investigation in some way, versus in the case of opportunities, here is something that could be done about that. And these are often treated together. So you see that in all three cases of different persons, there is a lot more recognition of a problem than there is trying to suggest something to do about that. Acknowledging successes was a small category for trying to say something positive about what the person has accomplished. And contextualizing concepts was an attempt to give some more, let's say, objective meaning behind why the person is coming up with that particular comment. When we move to explorations, we see that there are different categories, but some of these have similarities to the first one. So in terms of diagnosing perceptions and brainstorming suggestions, the second and third column here, those columns are similar to what we saw in triggers, where The person is either trying to share their own perceptions of the problem that was broached or trying to come up with something to do about that, brainstorming. The diverging perceptions item in column 1 is more of a recognition of some different point of view, such as, no, I don't think that's a problem, or I disagree with your take, I think it's actually blah, blah, blah. Concluding perceptions is an interesting category of trying to make a comment but not introducing more novel ideas. Like, you're not giving more reasons or more suggestions, you're just saying that the first person is right in some way. And elaborating perceptions was similar to contextualizing, where you are trying to give or get more information, but in this case, the idea of elaborating means that you're trying to better understand what has already been said, or you're trying to explain what has been said earlier. So we see here that diagnosing and brainstorming, like the triggers with problems and opportunities, are much more abundant, which makes sense in this context. For both triggers and explorations, what all three participant types are trying to do is they're trying to suggest that something is flawed or could be enhanced with the paper, and or here's a way to go about that. Now, with integrations, what we're trying to do is we're trying to move a conversation to some type of group notion of what to do. So when it came to explorations earlier, everyone shares their own perception of the trigger, whereas integrations tries to take, let's say, the trigger and the exploration from earlier and comes up with something new to think about based on that. And integrations are also trying to come up with essentially a consensus view, whereas something like 2 or more people might potentially agree on this. So the first 4 columns in this slide are focused on this. What we have here are converging, synthesizing, presenting, and qualifying. And in this case, what we see is that most of the time, people are either trying to present a whole new solution that they think others have not really come up with yet, or they are trying to show some type of agreement and reasoning behind the perceptions that have been shared. In this case, we have some synthesis combining different solution types, and we also have some qualifying, some warnings, which in this case often come more from the instructor. But with the resolutions, there's not much to discuss, unfortunately, because we don't see circumstances where we are trying to apply that solution or suggestion in any particular way, or trying to challenge that. So wrapping up the conversation about trends, here are the main takeaways, and this slide has a larger breakdown of the rotation of practical inquiry as well as indications within the posts. Essentially, the vast majority of threads in all of these classes stop at perceptions, which are triggers and explorations. When threads get longer, there's often more potential for multiple comment types as well as practical inquiry development. And writers were more likely to return to conversations than respondents, but not as often as instructors. So in a lot of cases, we're seeing the writer and the reader trying to get their work done, basically. Now, regardless of comment type, most threads featured 1 comment per person, and with some threads having comments from 2 different people. So that's something to consider as well, that there are some conversations that really don't advance inquiry as well, partly because it's only a 2-person conversation. So I'll wrap up quickly with my notable takeaways. What we're seeing here is practical inquiry that does not provide a lot of evidence that the writer can be satisfied or capable of incorporating suggestions into revisions. So a reasonable explanation for this is that everybody took their turn. They said what they wanted to say about their thoughts on the paper, and they moved on. And sometimes the third person in those groups turned that into actual integrations, and sometimes they just explored more. Now, this is not a statement that the response was unhelpful. Rather, it just doesn't provide a lot of evidence that the style of conversation was so essential or important. So that's something that needs to be investigated in further studies. There might also be a need to better probe the concept of workload here. After all, students are reading and writing in their L2, instructors are commenting on many other papers. The dissertation doesn't have a lot of data that exclusively tries to probe why that might have been the case. So thank you for watching. You can see my references right here, as well as my bio. You can also email me at dehondg@gmail.com if you have any further questions. I hope the presentation was helpful to you, and I hope you enjoy the conference. Thank you.